Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. How wonderful to see you all. What a packed house. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name's Coron Beaton-Wells, and I'm the Dean Internal here at the Melbourne Business School, working alongside our Dean here, Ian Harper, from whom you'll be hearing in just a moment. Well, first of all, let me say, well done, you. We're coming out on a dark and chilly Melbourne winter morning and coming out in numbers. It is just wonderful to have you with us at our breakfast series. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to the many who've chosen not to crawl out of bed at a ghastly hour. I think there's some 237 of them online joining us today. So isn't that great? Let's give them a hand of applause and say welcome. This is indeed one of our most popular events that we've held since you could do these things back in person. It's been sold out and we've had a waiting list. And I think that is an obvious and strong testament to the topic, to our wonderful speaker, and of course, to the sense of community that Melbourne Business School always brings to these events. Let me start now formally by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we gather here this morning at the Carlton campus of the Melbourne Business School. On behalf of you all, I pay my respects to them, to their country, their connection to culture, and of course to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I do pay my respects too to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who join us here this morning. So without further ado, and hopefully before your second coffee of the morning, let me introduce you to our amazing guest speaker, Ian Learmonth, the CEO of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Ian is going to deliver this address and discussion alongside another Ian, of course, to speak of our Dean Ian Harper, and that was not organised to have two Ians for this event. But you are also going to hear from our colleagues from the Centre for Sustainability and Business, a really flourishing centre in the school at present, one ably led by Professor Glenn Hutker, who you'll hear from too in a moment, and his colleague here, the Executive Director, Gary Veal. I know many in the room have already met with or heard from in some way, Glenn and Gary. So to our speaker, Ian Learmonth. Ian has more than 30 years of experience as a financier and investor. He's worked in Australia, Asia, and Europe across asset finance, clean energy, and major infrastructure projects, as well as pioneering Australian social impact investing. Prior to his appointment to this current role, Ian established Social Ventures Australia Impact Investing, which included raising venture capital and affordable housing funds, as well as launching Australia's first social impact bond in 2013. Previously an executive director of Macquarie Group for 12 years, Ian's had extensive global investment banking experience. He established and led various Macquarie businesses, including the European Renewable Energy and Carbon Credit Investments business, cross-border asset and structured finance and securitization in Asia and Europe. That is a mouthful. As CEO of the CEFC, Ian's overseen the organization's growth, where cumulative investment commitments now exceed 10 billion and have expanded into grid augmentation, large-scale battery storage, green hydrogen, electric vehicles, and recharging infrastructure. So now, before I invite the two Ians to the stage, let me call on my colleague Glenn from the Centre to say a few words to you. Thank you, Glenn.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. So as a leading business school, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to help organizations of all size and leaders at all levels transition to a more sustainable economy. And in terms of the environment, the Center for Sustainability and Business is our mechanism for doing that. We combine expertise across all the disciplines of business with critical sustainability knowledge, often in partnership with our colleagues from the broader university. And in combination with our partners, some of whom have joined us, including Bill Quince from NAB, we equip leaders through our research, our teaching, and our corporate engagement. If you've yet to connect, we'd welcome the opportunity for a conversation. And with that, let me ask Ian to come forward.
Thanks, Ben. Come on up,
Thank
Ian.
you.
Why don't you take that one? I'll take this one. I made a wisecrack about the two Ronnies. 3/4 of the audience wouldn't have a clue what we're talking about.
No, you're going to be of a certain vintage for that one.
Well, good morning, everyone, and Ian, particularly to you. Welcome, and it's wonderful to have you here at the school. And not only to be able to have another Ian on the stage, but a fellow Queenslander, a fellow UQ grad, and as I discovered this morning, we went to the same school. So how do you like that?
That's right.
Anyway, it's a great place to start. Ian, you've managed to pack this house out, and we have a large number of folk online as well. There's obviously enormous interest in, I think, the topic of sustainability in the broad, but in particular, this notion of sustainable finance. I have to say that as a board member of the Reserve Bank, I know a little bit about unsustainable finance, but I don't think we're here to talk about that. But sustainable finance or green finance, why don't we start by you just unpacking in the most general way for our audience, which has a range, I think, of exposure and experience in this area. What are we talking about when you say green finance?
Yeah, look, thank you. And look, thank you for coming out. I'm sure you're coming out as much for the biggest issue of the day as much, I'm sure, as me. But yes, look, green finance, sustainable finance, it's the, interesting kind of terms. I think, more broadly, investment increasingly is about sustainability by definition. I think, these sort of narrow terms are probably a bit less understood. I think people think about, when they hear the expression green finance, they probably go to a place such as green bonds, climate bonds, sustainability bonds. And, that is, of course, a developed field of investing, and organizations are out there issuing instruments that are backed by underlying projects. For example, might be a portfolio of wind farms, might be some highly sustainable real estate investments, and they can issue a green bond, and someone's, an independent agency's looked at that particular instrument and they've classified it a green bond. But that's such a narrow, that's a narrow thing. I mean, having said that, the world's green and climate bond markets are growing spectacularly. In fact, Melbourne University is about to issue, I don't probably not their first green bond, but they're I only heard the other day that Melbourne Uni are out there issuing a green bond. But as I say, that's a narrow part of the world. Bonds. There's just everything out there. Capital is now being mobilized to invest in this transition, and it is everything from project finance, corporate finance, investing in funds, large scale, small scale, venture capital, early stage investment, and things like green bonds. So when I hear people talk about sustainable finance and so on, I kind of think maybe they mean the whole thing.
Yeah.
They're probably terms of art,
Yeah.
in a way. But look, no doubt we'll kind of dig into some of those particular sectors.
Yeah, no, that's good, Ian. Thanks. But is the common link here marshalling finance to fund the energy transition? Is that the common link?
I think that's very much the link. Ian.
Okay, so you may be investing in a project which is literally doing that, right? Either it's in some way promoting net zero or facilitating clean energy generation, or it could be somewhere else in the chain, but ultimately it ends up there. Is that probably right? That's
right. And there are things that people most identify with that sort of capital, and that's particularly invest in the electricity sector.
Yeah,
when people are investing in wind and solar and battery, they go, I get that. But there, of course, there are enabling technologies, and that's everything from the lithium mine in WA, investing in that, because that's part of the enabling kind of technology that goes into the battery, that goes into the Tesla and displaces tailpipe emissions. So it's such a broad range. It's everything from residential property and how that's being greened up with green mortgages that are now currently on offer. So it's a very broad space.
Okay. So Mark Carney was the former governor of the Bank of Canada and then of the Bank of England. He has written quite extensively about this, and of course he's used his authority within the financial sector to really try to whip up enthusiasm and direct, to the extent that he can, funds in this broad direction. So, and my understanding is that he's signed up about $130 trillion worth of investments from pension funds and banks and others for people who are driving in this general clean energy transition direction. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's behind that? And I suppose the implications for this country as, fossil fuel exporter, reliant on capital inflow. How do we sit alongside an environment where a lot of people are saying, you know what, we have to be investing in this, perhaps more so than that, or we need to be investing in ways of making this cleaner than it presently is.
Yes.
So where do we sit in all of that? And tell us a little bit about this Carney venture.
No, definitely, certainly. And I had the privilege of being in Glasgow for COP26, where which was fascinating. Yeah, and where as Mark Carney made that announcement of $130 trillion of private sector capital that's wanting to invest in this transition, and that's the BlackRocks and the KKRs and the sovereign funds, and it's a very it's a broad range of capital, and I'd have to say, as an overarching observation, there is a huge amount of capital that wants to do this. They're being forced to do it by, if you're an industry super fund, even here in Melbourne, your members are driving those trustees to invest in this change. The one challenge with that is all that capital still wants to make the appropriate return in most cases. So, and that's a bit our life as well at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, is balancing this very motivated $130 trillion of capital, however it might manifest itself, and the underlying investments that have got to look like a sensible investment for that money. But back to the that capital, I think some of the things that it's trying to achieve is, firstly, allowing the finance sector itself to get to net zero, and help the finance sector drive its clients as well, and its borrowers and investee companies to get to net zero. So understanding the taxonomy and the various measurement systems and trying to get some a universal approach to that. It's also another aspect, if you kind of look into that 130 trillion, is to invest in emerging economies, developing countries as well. A lot of emissions, of course, coming out of China and India. So there's a few elements to it. Australia, as you say, Ian, just before Glasgow happened, of course, the previous government announced net zero by 2050. And Australia does and did have, and look, it probably continues to have a reputation as a country that has had a lot of its success off the back of fossil fuels by, it's the very nature of Australia and its resources. The times are changing, of course, and we saw, in the last election, a new government, which has now undertaken 43% carbon emission reductions by 2030, based on 2005 baselines, and 82% renewables by 2030. So there's a lot of work that will need to be done to achieve that. It was interesting this week, the head of the COP, which is currently hosted by the United Kingdom. So Alok Sharma, who's a British cabinet minister, out in Australia, and he's meeting with the Australian government yesterday and today, and in some ways sort of checking up in a way on the commitments that have been made, and how are you now, Australia, going to get to where you need to get and what needs to be done. And he'll hand that over later in the year to Egypt. Egypt will take over as COP27. And Australia has ambitions to take over the hosting of that, probably COP29, I think is the ambition. So if we do that, I think the Albanese government would like to do it here and share it potentially with some Pacific Island nations as well, because, you know, that we of course see that in very stark kind of relief.
Sure.
But, yeah.
Right on our doorstep. Let me just sharpen that a little bit, Ian. So the extent to which we either have policies in place that promote the transition or active investments that are available for people to invest in that promote the transition. Those two things would in principle lower the cost of capital, not just for the government, but for all borrowers in Australian dollars off the top of that. And the reverse is also true, I think. So what I'm driving at here then is that this, for us as a country, isn't just a matter of a nice to have. Just setting aside the longer term objectives of dealing with climate change, even if you're trying to borrow money to do something which has nothing to do with energy transition, you're likely to be affected by what's happening here. Am I right about that?
You are on many levels, Ian. You know, I think obviously, you know, the fossil fuel industry and even the resources industry, you know, the cost of raising capital, the challenge in raising capital has got spectacularly harder for them. And so they're in some ways being starved of capital as people are moving away from that. And areas that are addressing climate change, particularly ones that are doing it in a very deliberate way, are reaping the benefits of capital and policies, both at state and federal level, that are enhancing and supporting those transitional industries are also helping to lower their cost of capital. So you're right on a couple of levels.
So it's really using the power of the financial markets and the incentives which that drives to sort of hypercharge the transition, right? Really directing the self-interest of the financial markets in favor of the broader global interest in energy transition.
That's true. And you see it in a couple of direct policy initiatives in Australia. You've got things like the Australian carbon credit units. So if you're in the ag sector and you're reconfiguring the way that you rear livestock or the way that your cropping is undertaken, you can generate additional revenue through the federal government through carbon credit units. If you're a high emitting factory and covered by the safeguard mechanism, which is sort of Australian industry, which is one of the challenges. We all talk about the electricity sector, but of course, industry is a huge emitter, and they're subject to the highest 212 installations or factories around or production around Australia are covered by this net zero safeguard mechanism. And the new government are going to crank that up and put increasing pressure. And if they beat their emissions targets, they'll be potentially rewarded by that through carbon credits. So there's
in addition to a lower cost of capital.
Exactly. So I think there are huge advantages. So, and which is why people, there's almost, I don't know if there's a company, a large self-respecting company out there that's not trying to go through this transition.
Yeah, sure. Let me just circle back to the green bonds. You mentioned before, Ian, that at the end of the day, these investments still have to make money. And if you think, oh, well, that's some greedy banker. No, excuse me. This is somebody who's got their pension invested in a fund and thinking about their retirement. And they're wanting these investments to generate money, but in a way which is consistent with the energy transition. So is it the case that a number of these investments, perhaps the ones that the CEFC is promoting, like a green bond, part of the return is in the form of expenditure that governments would otherwise have to make in mitigating the impact of climate change? So, for example, if we do this properly, we haven't got to put up barriers against rising sea levels to the same extent we would have done before, right? Or we haven't got to deal with other types of adaptations that would be required to the same extent. Now, admittedly, this is a very long time horizon, but the financial markets have a long view.
Yes.
So is there that element, or is it much narrower? It's actually carbon credits, and it's, what you're doing here and now.
I think in the long term, that's true. That capital will ultimately lead to an abatement of carbon and will save governments. But maybe the other point I would make here, this capital we talk about, 130 trillion, or even just, the 2 trillion of superannuation for whatever it is, it's looking to invest in, yes, green bonds and wind farm portfolios and all these sorts of things, because they want to drive change, but they want to make money. Not everything in the climate transition, the clean energy transition, has a neat business model like a large-scale solar farm. In some cases, you need grant funding. These early technologies. How do we create the new electrolyzers to produce highly efficient green hydrogen? The next generation of solar PV panels. All these. Some of these things need grant funding. So they, and then eventually they might get to the venture capital investment stage. And other things like infrastructure, particularly, for example, the grid, which is a big problem in Australia, doesn't always necessarily lend itself to an obvious business model. You just got to build out billions of dollars of worth of transmission, and someone's got to pay for it. So you do structure it in a way that capital might be returned, but in some cases, it'll have to either be funded by taxpayer or electricity consumer. So not everything in this transition fits into a neat business model. In some cases, as I say, it needs government support and government to pay for things. In other cases, it needs rules and regs and market design. So I see returnable capital as a very significant part of this whole addressing this issue, but it's not everything.
Right. Okay. Good. Well, then let's narrow us down and talk about the CEFC, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Where do you fit in that whole pastiche? And my understanding is that you've now got $10 billion worth of projects that you've funded. So that's a significant sum.
Yep.
And what are the sorts of things you do? What is your remit in amongst all of that? And if, as you say, the Mark Carneys of this world are managing to marshal 130 trillion, with respect, why is the CFC involved?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So 10 years ago, give or take, the Gillard government, in fact, has established the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and so it's $10 billion of taxpayers' money to invest in the clean energy sector, very broadly defined: renewable energy, energy efficiency, low emissions technologies, debt or equity, only invest in Australia. And the objective of it, and back to your question, is to fill market gaps, catalyze private sector investment, and sort of drive change. Because we've got 10 billion. That's a lot of money. We're the world's biggest green bank, but it's nothing compared to the cost of what needs to be done for this transition. Even the 130 trillion isn't kind of probably the entire bill for it.
Correct.
So we work in a way where we look at transactions and we go, with us putting capital into this particular, venture capital's technology style company, or this not quite, all the contracting for this hydrogen and solar projects, not quite there, but it needs help and a few risks to be taken. They're the sort of things where we play a role, and we do that to try and encourage other investors to come in alongside.
The bellwether. We
are the bellwether. We might be the slice of mezzanine finance. We might be the first loss piece. We might be the 15-year loan, and the other banks can do 5, and that'll help them get comfort about refinancing risks, for example. So yes, that 10 and look, today, if you look at our balance sheet, we've got about 6 billion out the door, and we've got back about 3 or so over years gone by, because the portfolio is about 75% debt, 25% equity. So a lot of project finance in wind and solar in the early days, increasingly now in hydrogen and transmission and storage, because there's a whole transition going even within the renewable energy sector. There's lots of equity investments in funds where we've helped create new funds, where people go, we need a cornerstone investor. And if it's someone like CFC giving that confidence, we think we can raise this new agriculture fund, for example. So it's playing that, as you say, kind of bellwether, leading the charge, taking a few of those early kind of, hits in a way, taking some of the sting or risks out of projects or enterprises to bring in the bigger dollars down the track.
But are you charged to make a commercial return?
We are. So it's the government, well, the previous government, and they, for the 9 years of those three coalition governments, gave us a target. Moved around a little bit in the first couple of years, but certainly for the last 6 or so years, have said, can you shoot for a return of 3 to 4% over the 5-year government bond rate, which is very high. There are a few exceptions to, the hydrogen fund can be 1% over, and that's for 300 million. And so there's a few in amongst it, but and the current government are thinking about, do we lower that a bit? If you look at our portfolio today, it's about 2% over the 5-year government bond rate. We don't really sweat that. We look at every project, deal, opportunity on its merits. Yeah, sure. If someone comes, to us with some, venture capital opportunity, we look at and go, are we going to make 25% here? Because that's or the appropriate return for that sort of early stage Series A style investment. If we're doing a long dated senior secured financing on a battery, solar PV project, it might be 2% over the swap rate, and then you pool all that together. So we don't slavishly follow that, but yes, we're about making a return at the same time.
Okay. And are you able to raise additional funds yourself?
Because
you're not a green bank in that sense.
We're not in that sense. The government. We ring up Canberra and go, we need to make $500 million of investments over the next 6 months. They send the money through. You look at the balance sheet, $6 billion deployed on one side, on the other side, coming from the Commonwealth, coming from the Treasury. Now, so a lot of the additional capital coming from the private sector comes in at the project level. Sure. So you get it at that level. We have thought about, should we start raising funds?
Your own bonds.
Yes. And well, we can't issue bonds because the Act says, please don't issue bonds.
Oh, it does say that.
Yeah, it does at the moment. It does.
The Reserve Bank Act doesn't say that. Try harder.
So the AOFM in Canberra issues all those bonds.
They'd be on your case.
But we did go and get a financial services license not so long ago because we thought, why don't we raise our own funds? And so we're still
it's gone over well with the private banks,
but we haven't proceeded yet. We're still contemplating it. I think we're thinking, can we play a particular role, or should we leave it to the private sector? So we've got the license, but we haven't embarked on the journey quite yet.
No, that's interesting. Because come back to your point about plugging gaps, right? I think that's exactly right. That you can be the bellwether when there isn't anybody else, or they're waiting for someone to break the ice. To do that. Right? And if there's a clear gap for whatever reason, and you think, no, we can't see any problem here, so we'll stand into that gap and then see what happens. All that makes perfect sense to me. Competing with the private sector, well, we'll see how that one plays out.
Yeah, and that's a very important issue. Crowding out the private sector is something we cannot do. And so sometimes, and much to the frustration of some of, my eager investment
directors,
that they, because what sometimes happens is, there'll be a waste to energy project. There's no banks involved. We get in early. We go, all right, well, we'll do half the debt. And it takes another year before the feasibility studies and by then, there's 4 or 5 banks that want to do it, and we might have to go, we'll step out.
But you'll pick up that premium.
Well, we didn't even have to use our dollars. The private sector did it. And there's a frustrated CFC executive.
Oh, who wants to stay?
He said, hey, well, I spent 6 months on this deal. But, we go, you've done a great job even by not doing it. But we
hang on now. Go on now. This is the public sector. This is other people's money, right? Okay.
Yeah.
No, well done. Let me ask a very broad question before I open it up to the audience. So what we're going to do, folks, is that there will be a microphone roving. One of my colleagues will come to you. So if you want to ask a question, just put your hand up and I'll call you and we'll do that. For the folk who are online, if you'd like to ask a question of Ian, you just type into the Q&A function, and then there's someone monitoring, Tom or someone's monitoring will call the question out. So if you're online, don't feel as though you are offline as far as Q&A is concerned, you're in. And obviously for those in the room, you get the general idea. So think of something over the next minute or so. And let me ask you then this last question, Ian. So our audience, as near as we can assess, is very broad. There are people here who are interested because they're students, right? What's happening in the sector, which is terrific. Then there are those who are representing people who are looking for capital. So, you know, what does this mean for me if the cost of capital is going to be differentiated according to green criteria? And then there are, of course, those who are representing suppliers of capital, including the odd, you know, near retiree. Right? And so what are the implications for those who've got capital to lend, watching the implications of this transition and the green finance? So can you just give us a sort of quick sweep as to what you'd say the lessons are for those who've got capital to supply, those who need capital? Right? What are the sort of big takeaways for those two groups?
Yeah. And look, I guess there's quite different implications depending on the sort of capital it might be. But I think for, you know, financiers and investors, one of the things to be, I think, acutely sensitive to is greenwashing. I think that's a very important point. You know, I think there's probably a lot of investment opportunities and products around that could, you know, that might potentially be accused of that. You've got to make sure if you're investing in something and you're doing it because, you know, you want to see some kind of change, emission reduction. One, are these people going to do what they say they're going to do? And two, well, they're going to do it anyway. And you're providing them, you know, benevolent, cheap capital, and they were always going to buy that new bit of highly efficient equipment from Germany. But let's just tell them that we weren't until, you know, you guys came along. And we have to kind of navigate through that almost on a daily basis, because, you know, there are, you know, people are capital hungry, you know, in some of these industries, and you've got to kind of work out, you know, is this new office building, were they always going to build to 5.5, you know, neighbours, stars, and or are they saying, hey, we'll build it to that if you give us, because we offer sometimes sub-market debt, what we call concessional finance. And we only do that where we feel people are doing something, you know, quite special, that it's worth handing over effectively. You know, we're sort of providing value. It's a soft loan. Are they really driving to those, building out this new, you know, residential property development or this, you know, infrastructure in a very different way than they otherwise were going to do? So I think you know, I think people should be very cautious about that. On receiving, you know, if you're looking for capital, that's right. I mean, I guess, you know, stating the obvious, I think you've got to think about, are you getting the right sort of capital? You know, some of these early stage companies I see out there looking for either venture capital from the many an increasing number of clean energy or green orientated venture capital funds, family offices and impact funds and so on in Australia. When sometimes they probably should still be in the grant phase, because once you're raising venture capital, you're giving away, you've got to give up sort of ownership and so on. And the other thing is, you know, maybe you should be thinking about venture cap. Some people looking for debt or come to us and say they want to issue green bonds when really they're far too small and should be raising equity. You know, small companies, of course, don't want to burden themselves with debt, but that's more a sort of a question of getting the right sort of corporate finance. But there's a raft of opportunities out there if you are doing something interesting and high impact in this clean energy transition space, and it's such a broad space. You know, it's energy related, it's the built environment, agriculture, industry, infrastructure, transportation. There are so many options out there. You know, if you've got a compelling business model, there's some extraordinary opportunities that never existed even
sure.
5-7
Yeah,
years
sure.
ago.
Sure. So again, the CEFC can play a role there because you don't want to hog all this stuff to yourself.
We don't.
So if somebody comes to you with an idea, you might say, you know what, it's not quite for us, but we've got 6 mates here. Here are the, give these people a call. Or you could take a little slice and then ring around and say, what about this?
Yeah, and we're doing that all the time, Ian, and it's been interesting. I mean, I've been at the CFC for 5 years, and how many new players are out there that have been established both from early stage investing, how many banks have undertaken to invest in this sector with strong commitments to do so, pools of institutional capital coming from offshore into Australia. It's that's on the positive. That is incredible.
Okay, let's open up now to the audience and see who'd like to ask a question. Can you announce yourself and then ask the question? Here comes Mon with the microphone. Thank you.
Dave Collins from Synergetics Consulting Engineers. So we're not into finance at all, but we have noticed from an engineering perspective that the EU has now approved nuclear as being a green energy source. Will Australia do the same?
Ooh.
And does that impact your investment interests?
Thank you for that question. It's interesting. We get asked about nuclear quite a bit. When the CFC was established, there were 2 technologies that were precluded. One was carbon capture and storage. So not carbon capture use and storage. That's kind of a different world, and we can do that sort of thing. But we can't do carbon capture and storage, and we can't do nuclear. So technically, if someone even rolled up and said, hey, fabulous small nuclear reactor, or we couldn't do it, or nuclear power plant. Will Australia, I mean, I'm just, I don't speak from a government perspective on that one, but more as in a personal observation, and Ian, you probably have as many thoughts on this as I don't think either side of politics feels there's a social license with nuclear at the moment. So it's not been on anyone's agenda at this stage. There's increasing talk. Well, there's so many challenges with it as well. It could take 20, 30 years before we build a nuclear power plant. We don't have the supply chain. We don't have the engineers in Australia. Even these.
We do have the uranium.
We do have the uranium, but I don't think it's, for many reasons, on anyone's agenda.
Yeah. No, it is an interesting question, given that the EU has gone that way, as you say.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Morning. Thank you, Ian. It's been fascinating listening to you this morning. So Jason Opperman from K&L Gates, global law firm. I had a finance practice. Many of our clients, major banks, are moving into this clean energy area. A lot of them are pushing into ESG more broadly. 2 questions. Firstly, do you see the CEFC moving into a broader mandate position of ESG as opposed to just clean energy? And secondly, your views in relation to greenwashing and minimising the risks and the impact that greenwashing might have on the clean energy market here in Australia.
Yeah, just on ESG, yes, you're right. At the moment, we have a mandate that says all investments need to be complying. They've got to be some element of renewables, energy efficiency, low emissions technologies. Now that gives you a very, very broad mandate. We've made investments in plant-based meats companies.
Nice.
We're investing in soil carbon technologies. In fact, I think we've got one of our investee companies here today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, welcome, Downforce.
Mm.
Lithium mines, anything that enables those technologies, as I mentioned before, even kind of going upstream on a lot of those technologies. Now, that's the E part, obviously, of ESG. In terms of the social side, particularly, we always look at those things. Are we creating jobs? Are in traditional owner groups, is that being respected? Probably, as you would expect, but it's not, we couldn't, it would still have to comply from the E side first. So is the government kind of thinking about changing us in a way to do that? I don't think they have any plans at the moment to do that. What just in terms of what the government's plans for the CFC that are on the record at the moment, two big parts of the ALP's election policy. One is, of course, is rewiring the nation, $20 billion to invest in kind of rebuilding the grid to make it fit for purpose, to take up to 82% renewables by 2030 and beyond. And they're trying to follow AEMO, the grid operators integrated system plans. So we're working with the government. We're still in the, the whiteboards are out still on exactly how do we implement rewiring the nation. The other thing that touches a little bit on that is the National Reconstruction Fund, which is coming out of the industry rather than energy and climate change. So Ed Husick's portfolio, and that's a $15 billion fund that's investing in a very broad range of things about, I think, increasing manufacturing amongst other things in Australia, but also has a raft of clean energy things. About $3 billion of the 15 relates to it. But some of that also touches on the just transition, which you hear a lot about because coal-fired power stations, the retirement of that is accelerating. People need to go from those sort of jobs and communities into the next role. So I think there will be a lot of consideration in that particular side. Yeah, greenwashing. Well, as I say, I think that's about rigor around independent analysis about what underlying investments might be. A lot of green bonds, of course, are already come with their own rating agencies or the equivalent. So there's already particularly in the fixed income market, there's a lot of people who provide you with certification. There are the government in some areas are re-looking at their carbon credit regime through the Emissions Reduction Fund, because there's been a lot of accusation that a lot of carbon credits are in fact greenwashing. People say, I was always going to lock up that paddock up at the, up there. And by doing that, I've actually, I'm getting all these credits and I'm selling them back to the government at $35 a tonne. So Chris Bowen's doing a quick review of our carbon markets and the green hydrogen, just quickly to touch on that. The world's coming together to try and get the right, when that becomes a much bigger market and becomes the LNG market of tomorrow, how do we know whether that green hydrogen that you're selling me genuinely, did that electrolyzer, was it run by renewables and or was it, really just plugged into the grid? So I think it's a work in progress in some areas. Other areas are more mature.
Just to unpack that a little bit. I mean, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Do people say, well, all right, this is greenwashed because all you've done is count 1 and 2 and not 3? Is that? In other words, to escape the charge of greenwashing completely, you've got to capture the entire value chain. Is that right or not?
Well, it depends what standard you're applying in. And scope 3
One person greenwashes somebody else's carbon sequestration.
And it's, look, scope 3 is the great challenge.
Well, exactly.
And it's if you're doing 1 and 2, and you're in someone else's supply chain, then you've helped them on their scope 3, of course.
Naturally.
But the trouble is, we have so little control in many cases over a lot of scope 3, and it comes a little bit back to some of the supply chain issues that we have. Trace their way back.
But what are you allowed to say? I mean, to be blunt, the university is in exactly the situation. So we're trying to do, in fact, we are on track to deal with 1 and 2, but 3 is sort of a bit of a bridge. That's a difficult one.
It is
right. Saying, I mean, you say, okay, fair enough. We all accept that. So what? Are we greenwashing or not?
I don't.
What about scope 3? Huh?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Well, hang on a second. So where do?
I think today, I don't think, people wouldn't say, hey, you haven't addressed your scope 3, that's greenwashing. When people say, hey, I'm net zero by, as I speak today, because a lot of people's
Parking 3.
Yeah, 3, that's right. But a lot of people's net zero today is 1 and 2,
Yep.
and they normally buy their way out of trouble
With
for 2.
trees. Yep.
They go and buy credits. And, if you're a financial services company, you don't have a lot of scope 1, let's face it. You're not
Correct.
pumping out,
that's
CO2,
right.
but you're using a lot of power, and you've got people flying and so on.
Yes.
So you buy credits.
Yeah, a
to
lot of computer power. Too.
and the
Yeah,
computer, you buy credits where you can to offset that, but you're not necessarily looking at your laptops
Yeah.
and working out, that supply chain today. But I think it will come.
Right. And one of the things that you people presumably can help to fund and develop are these more accurate measurement systems.
We are indeed, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. Is there a question online before we go back to the?
Yeah, sure. We'll go to
Thanks,
one
Alex. Would
online.
you mind reading that one out?
Yeah, no problems. All right. So maybe following on from that discussion, we've got one from Ashley online now. So in vetting projects for clean credibility, how much are the sciences involved in the decision making? Does CEFC have in-house science experts?
Well, there's, certainly there's a lot of science, of course, because at the end of the day, it is all about science. We do have, we have a lot of engineers at the CEFC, and we
Question
have
was about scientists.
we don't
Sorry.
look, to answer your question directly. You're right. We don't have climate scientists per se. We tap into that expertise, be it the CSIRO, or we go out to other, science related, institutions and agencies. But we spend a lot of time on the carbon measurement side, which is economics meets science, meets judgment calls. Because there's easy ends to carbon abatement measurement. I invested in the solar farm, displaced a certain number of megawatt hours. I know the intensity of the grid. We can do that easily, as opposed to I invested in this, recharging infrastructure for electric vehicles. Gee, how many cars am I going to thing, and what will be the intensity over tailpipe emissions? I'm still filling them up with intensive electricity from the current grid. It's harder over the next 10 or 20 years. A lot of judgments need to be made. So maybe, look, in summary, a lot of scientifically minded people applying, their skills in the best ways we can to come up with some of these metrics. But yes, when we do go out for a lot of external expertise as well.
Right, consulting companies and others where the scientists are.
Yeah, all the time. I mean, there's a lot of incredible science in Australia in climate science, particularly University of New South Wales as well. I mean, obviously Melbourne University, but University of New South Wales has had a bit of a particular focus on, solar, solar PV technology, but Australian universities and particularly because Australia has some of these incredible global advantages. We've got sun, the wind, wide open spaces to do that. We've got more rooftop solar per capita than anywhere in the world. So you do get these, this incredible expertise.
The argument that we can do very well out of this transition.
We can.
Get on with the job.
That's right.
Sure.
Yeah.
There was a question in the back there, Mon. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Sorry, Jen, but just for the people online, particularly.
Sorry,
Mind
did you
starting
get?
again?
Yeah, okay, I'll start again. So I'm Jennifer from NG. One of the things that I've noticed in the last sort of 5-10 years in financing and developing renewables is this really increased level of sophistication of both lenders and equity and your sort of super funds, but also a move towards a real kind of partnership model. So you're getting the super funds and also increasingly your more dirty industry. So Shell, BP Lightsource, Shell and Meridian really moving towards a partnership and more of an active investor model. So that shift from passive capital to actually majority stake, really wanting to be involved early and staying involved. Do you see, just interested in your thoughts on that trend, and does CEFC also see themselves as increasingly an active investor, or are they more an enabler and a bit more of a passive, minority shareholder in sort of facilitating
it's
that
good.
transition?
Thanks, Jen, for that question. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, at the most spectacular, I guess, in terms of activist investing, not on our side, but in Australia, of course, is the Cannon Brooks investment in AGL, which has been extraordinary in terms of what, how it's kind of turned their plans on their head. I think just to your question or observation around, those fossil fuel related companies, the big energy companies in Australia, they are, they know there's an existential crisis that they're facing and are all in the clean energy game. There they all are investing in batteries, investing in wind and solar and hydrogen, to a company. Yes, there's a sense of reinventing themselves, but they're doing it very seriously. I mean, if they don't, they're gone.
Yeah, sure.
And when they kind of looked like they were, they weren't kind of heading down the right path, in came, Mike Cannon Brooks, and I see even, Scott Farquhar's looking at buying a pump storage listed company up there in Queensland. In fact, we financed the two Genex. But we're not an activist investor. I mean, obviously we're government funded. And when we put equity into a company, and we've invested in probably about 30 companies at various stages, we're only ever a minority investor. So, I mean, not to say that we're passive. We'll often take a board seat.
Oh, you will take.
We'll take board seats.
Okay.
Very often we've probably got 15, 18 board seats out there.
Oh, okay.
So we would, but we wouldn't ever, we wouldn't do something as, eye-catching as Grok takes, a stake in AGL. But we're working with all those companies, and we would work and help companies, and we have transition from, we see industrial companies that are burning coal to create heat to produce maybe, some particular an agricultural product in one example, and they were going to then transition to highly efficient gas and then to hydrogen. We might help a company like that, even though it's a two-step process. So look, it's interesting because you can't just turn at, look, it's not for us to invest obviously in coal fire or straight up gas projects, but the world just can't turn the capital off to all of those things. No. We've got to transition all these people across. So we will help in some cases with that as well.
Terrific. Let's have another go online. Alex?
Sure. Okay. We've got one from Angela online now. How is the tax landscape changing with the changes in focus on climate conscious programs and the direction of the government?
Tax landscape.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, we don't pay tax because we're a statutory corporation. That's probably not quite relevant to the question, but there are a few tax concessions here and there around it, not specifically to the clean energy sector. So if you invest in many of these venture capital funds, there are tax benefits for that. There are obviously tax rebates on R&D in Australia, very quite generous ones. I'm sure there'd be people who say not as generous as they could be, but quite generous. And there's lots of accelerated depreciation, of course, for investing in capital equipment that's often very much relevant to clean energy. There isn't a particular tax regime focused on, clean energy itself.
Now, you think of the tax concessions for the super funds, but that's across whatever they invest.
It is.
It's not specific to.
Yeah, I think if you look at the government's policy, it's been about, renewable energy targets, which created green kind of credits for the production of energy, the RET as it's known. There's these a lot of grant funding around hydrogen hubs and ARENA, which is of course the government's grant maker in the renewable energy sector. They're providing capital in that regard. They're putting the 20 billion into the grid. There's the CFC. There's the carbon credits that they pay you for carbon credits through the emissions reduction fund. So they've sort of used those channels. And then of course there's the states, which we shouldn't forget. And the states have been huge players in the clean energy sector. They've been writing these contracts for difference to get batteries up and away. They've been writing contracts for wind and solar, and the Victoria, this state's going to lead the country in offshore wind through grant funding and so on. But yes, but it hasn't been focused on tax drivers to date. It's used some of the really other levers, other sort of fiscal levers.
So is the EFC able to partner with the states in any way?
Oh, very much so.
Right. So you haven't
we
just
work.
stick to Commonwealth.
Oh, not at all.
Right.
We're working with all the states,
Righto.
and we worked in South Australia on the big battery, and
Yeah.
we're in New South Wales on home batteries. Yeah. So yes.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Okay. I think Peter, you've got the microphone. Away you go.
Thank you, Ian. I really enjoyed your presentation. Peter Lamel from Citywide Services. If we look at corporates around Australia and globally, there's still a lot of them who are doing insufficient on sustainability and sustainability reporting. Do you think there is an opportunity for global finance to really exert an influence on their activity? And I'm thinking what organizations like BlackRock are doing by insisting that companies have to meet certain requirements in terms of sustainability to be able to get funding.
Look, absolutely. And I think that's, the 130 trillion is really meant to be a lot about that. It is a lot about that. And you've got huge pools like BlackRock. They have over $1 trillion. And increasingly, I think capital will say, we won't invest in you unless you've got a net zero trajectory and a convincing one that can be independently audited, as well as other issues about, be it modern slavery or First Nations, or there's increasingly these requirements on people who are going to take capital from large sophisticated players. So I think that will drive so much of, and you only have to look at the top ASX 100, 200 companies. They've all got their ambitions, because they know if they don't, that next AGM
Can't get the money.
won't be fun. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. Another one on the, oh, sorry, ma'am, go right ahead.
Hello. Thank you, Ian. I think this conversation is really informative. And to be honest, I'm Candice, working in, I'm the financial professional working in the Ryco Hydraulic, which is the multinational organization in the manufacturing and distribution industry. I feel like when we're talking about the clean energy, for my industry, a little bit left behind at this moment. And I just want to see, like, as from my standing point, I'm quite interested when you mentioned about the sustainable financing. And currently, I know it's starting happening in the investment capital market. And for us, if standing in the manufacturing and distribution industry, what we can do in next 3 to 5 years, which can make us more proactive to the changing and also the challenging we're going to face with. Because, for example, for us, quite a few equipments and we provided to across several industries like agriculture, forestry, mining, the marine construction infrastructure. I feel like all these things gonna to happen to us eventually, although now I still haven't heard too much sound in our industry. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Candace, so what is it that you're manufacturing? Is it Ryco, did you say?
Yeah,
That's
hydraulic
filters.
fittings, the equipment which for the fluid conveyance.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Manufacturing and distributing filters for diesel engines.
Yes, yes. Well, look, manufacturing, like a lot of industry, you're probably not so, I mean, it's possibly comes back a little bit to the scope 3 conversation as well, because if a lot of your the actual manufacturing of origin is outside Australia, which it probably is, I imagine. Is that
In many cases.
correct?
it would
In
be.
many, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
and
So
you're distributing them here.
Scope 3, sorry, when you mention about scope 3, do you see a kind of the timeline, like when we're going to be
Yeah.
affected?
that's
Wouldn't you
tough.
like to know the answer to
That's a
that?
tough question, but it sooner than later, I think is probably
Hope springs eternal.
yes. I think that's when some pressure, certainly pressure, will be exerted on, say, a manufacturer, like yours and your sector. Whereas, today, people are very much, that the people who are taking your products are very, they're worrying about their scope 1 and their scope 2 emissions, and getting capital and doing everything is probably their concern. The other thing, of course, it's great you've got a diversity of production. One of the biggest issues that we're seeing across, and not just the renewables sector, but more broadly the clean energy transition, is this supply chain issue. And I was at the Sydney Energy Forum, which was a gathering in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, which is an Indo-Pacific kind of gathering, and just looking at some of the biggest issues in this clean energy transition. And the number one issue that this forum was addressing was the supply chain. And there's, obviously China, that is an issue for Australia and a concern, because a lot of people don't have, you've got diversity with your, with other, other productions in manufacturing, whereas, there's a lot, particularly if you look at, PV, solar PV, 90% of solar PV panels made in China, 50, 60% of wind turbines coming out of China, the processing of critical minerals. So, there's kind of big challenges with that. And of course, the modern slavery issue, people are acutely sensitive to as well. So I think I know this is I'm sort of probably deviating a bit from it, but just broadly as a topic in terms of the importation of manufacturing and goods that are used in the transition here in Australia, that's another really big issue that Australia's, and I think India is looking whether it might, it's going to get into the business of PV manufacturing, and because, as I say, dominated so much by China. And when you look at some of those countries, like India, and what it's going to build out over the next decade in terms of wind, solar, battery, hydrogen, it's eye-watering, the scale of it. So it makes sense for them to do that. And even in Australia, some of these extraordinary projects like Sun Cable, I know people have got some views. Is it ever going to happen? Is it fantasy? Is it reality? But that's a 17 gigawatt, solar plant in the Northern Territory that's going to use a high voltage cable through Indonesia off to Singapore. You're using so many panels and other things, cables, inverters, substations. Australia could justify manufacturing domestically. So I think, and that's something that this new government really want to help support, is kind of getting into and not being caught up in international supply chains if we can, because it's a real challenge. It's a challenge with the transmission as well, just while we're onto it, because the amount of transmission that needs to be built, someone told me the other day, is like building poles and wires from Sydney to Perth and back. It's vast, and you're lining up with the rest of the world ordering cables from wherever they might be being made, China, Europe. So supply chain is a big issue.
Terrific. Okay. Now we're coming up against time, and hang on a second. Is there one online? Did you
Yeah,
say?
we'll do
Okay, let's
another
go
one
one
online,
there.
yep.
Then there's a gentleman in the middle. Yep.
Sure, yeah. We've got Nick online now. How are the CFC looking to partner or partnering with super funds or broader funds internationally?
Yeah, well, we work with lots and lots of super funds in the sense, particularly co-investing kind of with them, particularly in specialty funds or in some cases in projects. We recently announced a project where we're investing in solar and battery projects with a UK group called Octopus and Host Plus coming in alongside us, and a UK fund called Nest, and that's a sort of a classic example. Done a lot of stuff, of course, with Hester, who are very progressive, industry fund here in Melbourne. In fact, Melbourne, almost the home of the
industry funds.
industry funds.
Well, the whole thing.
And yeah, it's just fantastic that, and so much of that capital wants to invest, almost coming back to the start of the conversation in this sector, because their members are saying, hey, I'm a community minded person. I want to see my retirement savings investing in this transition. So they're often either, more often coming into other funds like a clean transport fund or an ag fund or a renewables fund, because one of the challenges with those big funds is if you just take them $100 million solar farm and say, hey, do you want to put $20 million of equity, let's say it's 100 million, you might have 40 million of equity, 60 of debt. Do you want half the equity, $20 million? They'll go, hey, I'm a $20 billion super fund, that's too small. So they often come into a fund, which might be a multi-billion-dollar fund. They might put a few hundred million into that, and in turn invest in a raft of different sorts of ways. So we bring in, we try and help kind of catalyze those people to come into those sort of funds, and international players. And the international players do take a lot of comfort. I mean, it's a double-edged sword from someone like CFC being a government investor financier, being in a fund. So you've got to be a bit careful. You don't want to go into something and it goes wrong and they go, I thought you guys came with a ring of confidence.
Don't take us to the wall. Right?
Yeah, that's right. But as I say, the capital need for this thing is huge, and it's going to come from retirement savings and pension funds and big banks, and we're the bit player, but we think we can accelerate and help these industry funds and super funds
swing up.
Yeah.
Sure. There was a question, I think. Sorry. Go ahead.
Hamish Hurley from KPMG. Look, thanks again for your time this morning. I guess back to the reporting questions from earlier, and looking at the search on your website might give me an answer, but do you think CFC are doing reporting sufficiently and transparently enough compared to others in similar sort of markets? And ultimately, probably more for your equity investments, but if performance is not meeting investment targets, would CFC ultimately withdraw equity from projects?
Well, a couple of things in there. We're obviously governed by all sorts of, government rules and regs around how we report. And so it's incredibly thorough. And yes, look, do have a look at our website. There's a huge amount of information. So every project we do, financing, investment, we have to make public. So, there's quite a lot of detail in every, and we've done something like 250 transactions directly, and we've worked with intermediaries like the banks and people like NAB and others, where we've provided finance to them cheaply, in some cases often below market, so they then can use their their bankers around the country to reach much smaller borrowers. So, and that we've probably done 10 or 15,000 ultimately transactions there. So we haven't reported on every one of those, but we have every wholesale deal that we've done, every direct transaction in much detail, including our expectations of carbon abatement not all our deals we can, if we can't point to it, then, you know, sometimes it's like, for example, if we do a transmission project, we don't assume any carbon abatement for something like that. So, but yes, lots of rigorous reporting. And as I say, you know, have a look at the website. In terms of, would we pull out of, well, look, if we're committed to a project in building out, and, you know, we said we'd put in X, you know, $1 million, but it's not meeting the covenants or requirements, then, you know, we like any financier, we would have to look at our rights. Maybe a question might have been more directed at if we were, say, losing money in a particular area, would we pull out of that particular sector? Well, I guess we'd weigh that up with, you know, we haven't lost any material money to date. But that's not to say, you know, there are, you know, a number of transactions that are challenged because economic conditions are challenged. And in some ways, people say to me, well, if you're not losing a little bit of money, you're probably not taking enough risk. And so there are a couple, and so maybe can reassure you, there are a couple that have been challenged. But particularly where we've invested, I take one area that's doing a little bit tough, or possibly even more than tough, is equity in some, you know, renewables projects are a kind of, particularly around grid constraints, where people kind of signed up and plugged into the grid, and then others kind of came into that area of the grid, and then the operator went, hey, we can't take you all, we're winding you back by 20%. If you've got something that's geared 4 or 5 times and equity's up in that pointy end of the capital thing, you know, that's going to hurt. So look, there are a few challenges around that, why we need to invest in the grid. But investing in the grid's a long game. It is, you know, you got to get through the countryside, you got to put down those poles and wires. But yeah, look, we're constantly, you know, evaluating and reviewing exactly where we should be playing and where we, you know, the private sector's taken over.
We're up, well, we'll take one last one. Okay, let's go.
Thank you. The two Ronnies, two Ians, I mean, very enlightening.
That's good.
From Acquisitive Intelligence. I'm curious, has there been an impact since COVID, supply chain issues, trade issues over the last few years from a sovereign defence perspective, perspective in Australia? Has there been any directly from the government, or has that impacted on you at all over the last few years, and especially when we see Russia-Ukraine situation at the moment?
Yeah, well, there's a few things in that. Yeah, COVID certainly had an impact on supply chains, and, you know, not just the renewables or clean energy sector. More broadly, it's tough out there. So yes, there's definitely been COVID challenges. A lot of projects have, you know, slowed down as a result of that. Yeah, and now we've got some of these issues, as you say, with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has led to all sorts of, other challenges, spikes in power prices, gas prices here in Australia. In some ways, higher power prices, of course, are good for, they're good for building out renewables. We're kind of happy on one side. Politicians don't like them. But if you're selling into the grid as a merchant provider of clean energy, wind or solar, high
prices are good.
You're happy with that, and because prices have been very, very low for a long time. But look, inflation's another challenge. The inflation and interest rates. If you look at a classic renewables project, it's all about capex. You don't pay for the fuel; it's free. There's a little bit of O&M. It's all about the cost of building that project, and that's gone up 20 to 30% in the current inflationary environment, and the cost of capital as well, and that's gone from rates were historically low for so long, and now rates, as we know, are on the way up, but not sure when they're going to flatten out. But even so that's a headwind that the sector's. Sorry, Ian,
I'm very, very quickly about to change the subject.
So we're high power prices is a bit of a bright spot on an otherwise challenging environment. Yeah,
I am going to claim the last question.
Yeah,
and it's more of a personal question. You spent a lot of time at Macquarie Bank.
Did.
You could be doing all of these sorts of things from that platform, if
Mm.
not Macquarie, from BlackRock or whatever. There's so much to be done. What's the appeal to you as a professional
Yeah.
in running a government agency, which is much smaller than these bigger organizations,
Yeah.
and as you say, has a particular remit? But given the excitement that goes with all that you've been describing,
Yeah.
what drives that?
Yeah. A good 10 or 11 years ago, stepped out of investment banking, Macquarie, all those years. And I was in the renewables business at Macquarie because I kind of felt like I wanted to step out of a fully for-profit kind of world and see if I could use my skills in making maybe a broader contribution. Very inspired by my father, who went to Melbourne University, did medicine here in the 50s, and dedicated his life to being a country doctor. And I thought, gosh, spending my life chasing bonuses at Macquarie has got to be more to it. I saw the use of capital in terms of the environmental space, even in my London Macquarie days. But when I came back, the renewables world was really going through some challenges about 2010. So I kind of got into the social impact investing side and kept a hand in the renewable sector. I sat on a few wind boards, so I made sure I knew what was sort of going on in the market. But coming back to the CFC, there's something really exciting about delivering on a policy objective. At the end of the day, yes, the private sector's doing fantastic stuff in the clean energy sector, but they have got their eye on the bottom line. Whereas we don't want to lose money because we'll lose our credibility and license to operate, but we're about the change and delivering on the policy objective. And there's something particularly exciting about that.
Yeah. No, that's terrific.
Yeah.
I'm going to invite Coron to come and close off our breakfast, but while she's coming up, Ian, thank you.
Thank
From
you,
one
Ian.
end to another. It's
Yes,
been a terrific conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, so have I.
And
Thank you
it's
for
good
having
night
me.
from him.
Thank you.
Yes, my thanks to Ian and on behalf of our whole audience here, as well as those of us joining online. Very stimulating. This is a topic that I sense beyond some in the audience who are obviously steeped in it. More broadly, there is a lot of learning and understanding still to be done. So you've made it very accessible. The other comment I'd make is certainly in the popular press, at least, there's so much focus on targets and numbers, less so on how we're going to get there, and even less so on where the investment is going to come from. So hearing from you today about the level of the investment, the nature of it, and the momentum behind it is both exciting and heartening. So a small token of our appreciation. Thank you for putting us into your busy schedule.
Thank you.
You're much in demand. It's been wonderful.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you.
I can thank the other Ian as well for your characteristic aplomb and bonhomie when we hold these events. Thank you to all of you, both virtually and in person, for joining us, engaging with us in the discussion. And a special acknowledgement and thanks to my colleagues Glenn and Gary and Don and Alex at the Centre for bringing us all together like this. The Centre, as was reflected in Glenn's comments, is really spearheading and shaping our internal discourse on how we fulfill our mission of sustaining the future through leaders and ideas. So thank you again to you and our wonderful events team and catering team. Please don't rush away. We're only closing at 9, but do bear in mind, of course, that this is a regular series of events for us. And the next one coming up is on the 13th of August with Fred Hilmer, talking about his new book, rather provocatively and perhaps fittingly called What's Wrong with Boards. So we hope you will join us for another breakfast on the 30th of August. You can pick up a card on your way out. But that's all for the formalities. So thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.